The black SUVs rolled into Steel Valley just as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the desolate town into an eerie twilight. The town had been abandoned for decades, ever since the steel mills that once thrived here had mysteriously shut down. Rumors had always swirled about the town's demise: cursed land, satanic rituals, and the infamous Devil of Steel Valley, a shadowy figure said to haunt the old mills. But now, something far more sinister had been reported. The government had dispatched a new team of paranormal investigators, a crew seasoned from their previous encounters with the supernatural. But this case was different. This was darker. Do you feel that? Agent Carter, the team leader, asked as he stepped out of the SUV. The air was thick with a suffocating humidity, but there was something else, a weight, a palpable sense of dread. Beside him, Agent Ramirez nodded, his hand instinctively reaching for the cross hanging around his neck. The team of 8 included 2 mediums, a tech specialist, and a couple of combat-trained operatives. They were well prepared, or so they thought, armed with the latest in ghost hunting technology, thermal cameras, EVP recorders, and even a prototype device said to capture the essence of a spirit. They were here to investigate the recent disappearances of 2 other teams who had been sent to Steel Valley, both of whom had vanished without a trace. Their first stop was the steel mill at the heart of the town. The massive structure loomed over them, a decaying monument to a time long gone. As they approached, the silence was shattered by a distant scream, a sound so filled with terror that it sent shivers down their spines. "Everyone stay sharp," Carter ordered, his voice barely concealing his own unease. They entered the mill, the darkness swallowing them whole. Flashlights scanned the decrepit interior, revealing rusted machinery, crumbling walls, and the pervasive smell of rot. But it wasn't just decay, they all felt it now. The oppressive sense of being watched. As they moved deeper into the mill, the temperature plummeted. Breath misted in the air, and then, without warning, the sound of footsteps echoed through the vast chamber. Heavy, deliberate footsteps that seemed to come from all directions at once. "Who's there?" Carter demanded, his voice echoing back at him. But there was no answer, just the relentless sound of the footsteps, growing closer and closer. Ramirez shined his flashlight towards the source, and for a brief second, they saw it, a tall, shadowy figure, its eyes glowing a malevolent red, before it vanished into the darkness. "It's him," whispered one of the mediums, her voice trembling. "The Devil of Steel Valley." Before anyone could react, the figure reappeared, this time behind one of the operatives. A guttural scream tore through the air as the operative was lifted off his feet by an unseen force and violently thrown against the wall. Blood splattered across the rusted metal, and the team erupted into chaos. "Fall back," Carter shouted, but it was too late. The darkness came alive around them, and the devil was just getting started. The team retreated, dragging the wounded operative, Jenkins, through the mill's winding corridors. His breathing was ragged, blood pouring from a gash on his head where it had collided with the steel wall. Every step echoed through the oppressive silence. Every shadow seemed to move. It was as if the entire building was alive, hungry for their fear. "We need to get out of here," Ramirez yelled, his voice barely masking his panic. His usually steady hands shook as he tried to scan the area with the thermal camera. But all he saw was cold, an unnatural, bone-chilling cold that clung to everything. "Keep moving," Carter commanded, trying to maintain order. They were a trained team, but the situation was spiraling out of control. He could feel the darkness closing in, tightening like a noose around them. As they neared the exit, a loud metallic screech filled the air, freezing everyone in their tracks. The massive doors they had entered through slammed shut with a deafening clang, trapping them inside. "Damn it," Carter cursed, slamming his fist against the door. No amount of force would budge it. The devil had them right where he wanted them. "Listen," one of the mediums, Claire, whispered urgently. "Do you hear that?" The team fell silent, straining to listen over the pounding of their own hearts. Faintly, just barely audible, was the sound of a woman sobbing, her voice filled with despair and agony. The sound echoed through the mill, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "It's coming from below," Claire said, pointing to a rusted staircase descending into the depths of the mill. Her eyes were wide with fear, but there was a strange determination in her voice. "We have to go down there." "Are you crazy?" Ramirez spat. "That thing is down there. We need to find another way out." "We're already trapped," Claire replied, her voice trembling but resolute. "The only way out is through." With no other options, the team descended into the bowels of the mill. The staircase groaned under their weight, threatening to collapse at any moment. Below, the sobbing grew louder, mingled with other sounds. Whispers, screams, and something else, something that made their skin crawl. At the bottom of the stairs, they found themselves in a large, open chamber, filled with old machinery and pipes. The air was thick with an acrid stench, like burning flesh. In the center of the room stood an old, cracked mirror, its surface tarnished with age. The sobbing seemed to come from the mirror itself, filling the room with its haunting wail. As they approached, the mirror suddenly flared to life, showing them not their own reflections, but scenes of horror. Jenkins, now unconscious, being dragged into the darkness by unseen hands. Ramirez, covered in blood, his eyes wide with terror as something loomed over him. And Carter, staring into the mirror with a look of utter despair. Then, the mirror shattered, sending shards of glass flying through the air. Claire screamed as one of the shards sliced across her arm, blood splattering onto the floor. "We need to get out of here," Carter yelled, but before they could move, the devil reappeared, standing between them and the staircase. His red eyes glowed with malevolent delight as he advanced towards them. The team opened fire, but their bullets passed through him like smoke. The devil's laughter echoed through the chamber, a sound that chilled them to the bone. He raised one clawed hand, and the room plunged into darkness. In the pitch black, the sounds of their screams and the devil's laughter mixed with the haunting sobs, echoing endlessly in the nightmarish labyrinth beneath Steel Valley. The blood had only just begun to flow. Steel Valley was shrouded in a perpetual haze as the investigation team gathered at the old steel mill. The air was thick with a metallic taste, as if the land itself remembered the blood and sweat poured into it. The team, led by Agent Mark Raven Williams, consisted of hardened veterans and newcomers alike, but none were prepared for what they were about to face. The mill was a labyrinth of rusted machinery and decaying catwalks. Every step echoed eerily, reverberating through the empty halls. Agent Sarah Sparrow Jensen, known for her sharp instincts, felt a chill run down her spine. The place felt alive, as if the shadows were watching them, waiting. Raven directed the team to split into pairs and cover more ground. He paired himself with Sparrow, sensing her unease. As they moved deeper into the mill, they found themselves surrounded by an unnatural silence. The sounds of their footsteps seemed muted, swallowed by the darkness. They entered a vast chamber filled with ancient furnaces. The walls were lined with twisted metal sculptures, remnants of the once thriving industry. Sparrow shone her flashlight across the room, its beam flickering as if struggling to cut through the oppressive gloom. "Do you feel that?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Raven nodded. The temperature had dropped suddenly, and the air was thick with the scent of sulfur. A low growl echoed through the chamber, sending shivers down their spines. They weren't alone. A shadow moved at the edge of their vision, quick and fleeting. Raven raised his weapon, eyes scanning the room. "Stay close," he instructed, his voice tight with tension. Sparrow's flashlight flickered again, and then it went out entirely, plunging them into darkness. She cursed under her breath, fumbling for her backup light. But before she could switch it on, a loud clang echoed through the chamber. Something heavy had fallen, and the sound reverberated like a death knell. Raven pointed his weapon towards the source of the noise. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice steady, but there was no response, only the deafening silence. Then they saw it, a figure standing in the far corner of the room. Its form was obscured by shadows, but they could make out the gleam of eyes reflecting the dim light. The figure was tall, unnaturally so, its limbs elongated in a grotesque mockery of the human form. "Show yourself," Raven demanded, stepping forward. But the figure didn't move. Instead, it seemed to grow darker, the shadows around it swirling like a vortex. Suddenly, it lunged towards them, moving with impossible speed. Raven fired, but the bullets passed through the figure, striking the metal behind it with a loud ping. The creature's laugh echoed through the chamber, a deep, guttural sound that chilled them to the bone. Sparrow's flashlight flared back to life, and the figure vanished as quickly as it had appeared. They were left standing in the empty chamber, hearts pounding in their chests. What the hell was that? Sparrow gasped, her hands shaking. Raven didn't answer. His mind raced, trying to process what they had just encountered. Whatever it was beyond anything they had faced before. A darkness older than the mill itself, something that thrived on fear and despair. They needed to regroup with the others, but as they turned to leave, they heard footsteps approaching, heavy, dragging footsteps that echoed through the mill. And then the screams began, echoing through the halls, carried by the winds of Steel Valley. The screams tore through the night, piercing and shrill, coming from every direction at once. Raven and Sparrow froze, their eyes meeting in a moment of shared horror. Whoever, or whatever, was in the mill wasn't alone, and neither were they. "We need to find the others," Raven said, urgency lacing his words. He turned on his earpiece, calling out to the rest of the team, but all he got was static. The mill seemed to have swallowed their communications, trapping them in its dark heart. They moved quickly through the winding corridors, weapons at the ready. Every shadow seemed to pulse with malevolence, and every creak of the old structure set their nerves on edge. The air grew thicker, more oppressive, as if the very walls were closing in on them. As they rounded a corner, they found Agent Michaels slumped against the wall, his face pale, his breathing ragged. Blood seeped from a deep gash in his side, staining the floor beneath him. "Michaels!" Sparrow knelt beside him, her hands already moving to apply pressure to the wound. But as she did, Michael's eyes widened in terror. "Behind you!" he choked out, his voice barely a whisper. Raven spun around, but it was too late. A creature lunged at him from the shadows, a twisted amalgamation of human and beast, its skin leathery and mottled. Its eyes glowed with a sickly yellow light, and its mouth opened in a snarl, revealing rows of jagged teeth. Raven fired, but the creature was fast, dodging the bullets with unnatural agility. It swiped at him with long, clawed fingers, catching him across the chest. Raven stumbled back, pain flaring as blood soaked through his shirt. Sparrow drew her knife, slashing at the creature as it moved towards her. The blade connected, slicing through its flesh, but instead of blood, a thick black ichor oozed from the wound. The creature hissed, recoiling in pain, before lunging again. The battle was brutal and chaotic, the confined space amplifying every sound. The thud of bodies hitting the floor, the guttural growls of the creature, the sharp intake of breath as injuries mounted. Despite their training, Raven and Sparrow were quickly being overwhelmed. Just when it seemed the creature would tear them apart, a deafening roar filled the chamber, shaking the very walls of the mill. The creature hesitated, its head snapping towards the source of the sound, before it vanished into the shadows, leaving Raven and Sparrow gasping for breath. Raven struggled to his feet, clutching his bleeding chest. "What the hell was that thing?" "I don't know," Sparrow replied, her voice shaking. "But it's not the only one. We need to get out of here." They helped Michaels to his feet, the wounded agent barely conscious, and began to make their way back to the entrance. But as they did, they couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, of something lurking just out of sight, waiting for the right moment to strike. The screams had stopped, replaced by an eerie silence that only heightened their fear. The mill felt like a tomb, and they were trespassers in a place where the dead didn't rest peacefully. As they reached the entrance, they found the door barred shut, twisted metal and debris blocking their escape. They were trapped, the weight of the darkness pressing in on them from all sides. And then, in the distance, they heard it again, the sound of footsteps, heavy and deliberate, drawing closer and closer. They weren't alone, and whatever was in the mill wasn't done with them yet. The air was thick with tension as the team approached the old steel mill, the heart of Steel Valley's industrial past. The towering smokestacks loomed over them like sentinels of a bygone era, their rusted surfaces dripping with rainwater that had begun to fall steadily. The mill had been abandoned for decades, but rumors of strange occurrences had persisted. Ghostly apparitions, eerie noises, and most chillingly, the sight of a demonic figure lurking in the shadows. Stay sharp, everyone, Carson, the leader of the Secret Service Paranormal Investigation Team, whispered through the comms. His voice was steady, but the unease in his eyes betrayed the fear he was suppressing. This was no ordinary haunting. They were dealing with something far more sinister. As they entered the mill, the floorboards creaked ominously underfoot. The faint sound of clanking metal echoed through the cavernous space, though no machinery had operated here in years. The air was thick with the smell of decay and rust, a suffocating miasma that made their stomachs churn. Suddenly, a loud crash reverberated through the building. The team whirled around, flashlights cutting through the darkness. But there was nothing, just shadows playing tricks on their eyes. Or so they thought. Did anyone else see that? Jade, the team's tech expert, asked, her voice trembling slightly. She was staring at a spot just beyond the reach of their lights, where the darkness seemed to thicken unnaturally. What did you see? Carson demanded, his grip tightening on his flashlight. I think it was a person, but it wasn't human, Jade replied, her face pale. It had glowing red eyes. Before anyone could react, the air was filled with a blood-curdling scream, the sound of pure agony and terror. It was coming from deeper within the mill. Without thinking, the team rushed toward the source of the sound, their hearts pounding. They found a group of people, workers from the rescue team who had gone missing earlier. Their bodies were contorted in unnatural positions, their faces frozen in expressions of sheer horror. Blood pooled around them, soaking into the grime-covered floor. "Dear God," muttered Sam, the team's medic, as he knelt to check for pulses. But it was too late. They were all dead. "What the hell happened here?" Carson asked, his voice barely a whisper. "We need to get out of here," Jade urged, her eyes darting around the shadows. Whatever did this is still here. But as they turned to leave, the temperature in the room plummeted, and the lights on their equipment began to flicker wildly. A low growl rumbled through the air, sending a shiver down their spines. From the darkness, a figure emerged, tall, gaunt, and cloaked in shadow. Its eyes burned like embers, and its mouth twisted into a cruel grin. This was no ghost. It was something far worse. "Run!" Carson shouted, but it was too late. The entity lunged at them with inhuman speed, knocking them to the ground with a force that sent their equipment scattering. Jade screamed as the creature pinned her to the floor, its claws digging into her flesh. Blood sprayed from the wounds, splattering across the rusted metal and sending the team into a frenzy. "Get it off her!" Sam yelled, fumbling for his gun. But the creature was too strong, too fast. It lifted Jade as if she weighed nothing and hurled her across the room, where she collided with a steel beam with a sickening crunch. The team opened fire, but the bullets seemed to pass through the creature as if it were made of smoke. It laughed, a sound that echoed through the mill like the tolling of a death knell. And then, as quickly as it had appeared, the creature vanished, leaving them alone in the dark, with nothing but the sound of Jade's labored breathing and the blood that continued to pool around them. The shock of Jade's brutal attack left the team in disarray. Sam, his hands trembling, struggled to stabilize her. Her breathing was ragged, her eyes glazed over with pain, and blood poured from the gaping wounds on her chest. Carson, meanwhile, was barking orders into his comms, desperately trying to contact the extraction team. "Where the hell is our backup?" Carson growled, but the only response was static. He slammed the comms unit against the wall in frustration. Suddenly, the lights flickered again, casting the mill into darkness before sputtering back to life. But this time they weren't alone. Figures began to materialize in the shadows, their forms hazy and translucent. They were the ghosts of the mill workers who had died in a tragic accident decades ago. Their faces pale, their eyes hollow, their bodies twisted in the agony of their final moments. They moved slowly, their limbs jerking unnaturally as they advanced toward the team. "Stay back," Carson shouted, raising his gun. But the ghosts did not heed his warning. Instead, they began to whisper, their voices overlapping in a cacophony of despair. "You cannot escape. You cannot escape. You cannot escape." The words reverberated through the mill, growing louder with each repetition until they became a deafening roar. The team covered their ears, but it did little to block out the noise. "Carson, we need to get out of here." Sam yelled over the din, his voice tinged with panic. But before they could move, the ghosts surged forward, their icy hands reaching out to grasp at the living. One of them grabbed Sam by the arm, and he let out a scream as his skin began to blister and peel away under the ghost's touch. "Help me!" Sam screamed, thrashing against the ghost's grip. But the more he struggled, the tighter the ghost held on, dragging him into the darkness. Carson fired at the ghost, but the bullets passed through it harmlessly. Desperation clawed at him as he watched Sam being pulled further and further away. "We have to get out of here now," Carson shouted, grabbing Jade and pulling her to her feet. But she was too weak to stand on her own, and he had to half carry her as they made their way toward the exit. The ghosts followed, their whispers still echoing in the team's ears. The air grew colder with each step, and the darkness seemed to thicken, pressing in on them from all sides. As they neared the exit, the doors suddenly slammed shut, trapping them inside. Carson cursed and pounded on the doors, but they wouldn't budge. The ghosts were closing in, their eyes glowing with an unnatural light. "We're trapped," Jade whimpered, her voice barely audible. "No, we're not," Carson said through gritted teeth. He pulled out a flare from his pack and ignited it, the bright red light cutting through the darkness and causing the ghosts to recoil. "Go, go, go," Carson urged. Shoving Jade through the narrow gap, he managed to force in the door. He followed her through, but as he turned to help Sam, he realized with horror that Sam was gone, pulled into the darkness by the relentless spirits. "Some!" Carson shouted, but there was no answer. The only sound was the crackling of the flare and the distant whispers of the ghosts. Jade tugged on Carson's arm, her face pale and streaked with tears. "We can't stay here. We have to go." Carson hesitated, his heart torn between the need to save his friend and the overwhelming fear that they were all doomed. But the sound of approaching footsteps, heavy, deliberate, and not at all human, made the decision for him. With one last look at the darkened mill, Carson turned and fled into the night, the whispers of the ghosts still echoing in his ears. The night was pitch black as the team prepared to venture deeper into the bowels of the abandoned steel mill. The air inside was thick with the smell of rust and decay, making every breath feel like an intrusion into a forbidden domain. Echoes of distant clanging metal and indistinct whispers haunted the corridors, as if the mill itself was alive with a malevolent presence. Agent Carter, the leader of the Secret Service Paranormal Investigation Team, SSBIT, reviewed the equipment one last time. EMF meters, thermal cameras, and spirit boxes buzzed and clicked, indicating activity. "We're heading into the heart of this," Carter said, his voice steady but his eyes betraying a hint of unease. "Stay close and keep communication open." The team split into pairs, each equipped with a walkie-talkie and their own set of ghost hunting tools. Carter and his partner, Agent Davis, moved toward the oldest part of the mill, where the shadows seemed to cling to the walls like a living entity. The deeper they went, the more oppressive the atmosphere became, as if the darkness itself was swallowing them whole. Suddenly, Davis froze. "Did you hear that?" he whispered, pointing toward a darkened alcove. A low, guttural growl emanated from the shadows, followed by the unmistakable sound of heavy footsteps. The footsteps, however, seemed to be all around them, moving closer and closer, yet no one was there. Before Carter could respond, the walkie-talkies crackled to life with frantic voices from the other teams. "Something's wrong. We're losing people. They're just..." The transmission cut off abruptly, replaced by static and eerie whispers in a language neither man could recognize. "All teams, report," Carter shouted into his walkie-talkie, but the only reply was silence, broken by the distant sound of metal scraping against metal. "We need to regroup. Now!" he commanded, but deep down, he knew that something terrible had already happened to his team. As they retraced their steps, they noticed something horrifying. The path they had taken was no longer there. The corridors twisted and changed, leading them in circles, deeper into the mill's labyrinth. Panic set in as they realized they were trapped. A sudden scream echoed through the mill, followed by a deafening silence. Carter and Davis rushed toward the sound, only to find one of their team members, Agent Thompson, lying on the ground, his eyes wide open in terror. His body was unscathed, but his soul seemed to have been sucked out, leaving nothing but a shell. Davis knelt beside him, trying to find a pulse. He's gone, he whispered, his voice shaking. Carter barely had time to process the loss when the shadows around them began to shift and writhe, taking on grotesque shapes. The air grew colder, and the growls returned, louder and more menacing. "We need to get out of here," Carter shouted, but deep down, he knew there was no escape from the darkness that had claimed Steel Valley. Carter and Davis, their nerves frayed and their courage tested, pressed on through the twisted corridors of the steel mill. Every corner they turned seemed to lead them deeper into the heart of the darkness. The walls, once cold and metallic, now oozed with a thick black substance that reeked of sulfur and decay. It was as if the very fabric of reality was unraveling around them. As they navigated the ever-changing labyrinth, they stumbled upon a massive chamber, the mill's central furnace room. The air was thick with a suffocating heat, and the flickering light from the remaining fires cast eerie shadows that danced on the walls. In the center of the room stood a massive, rusted furnace, its maw gaping open like the entrance to hell itself. "There's something here," Davis whispered, his eyes wide with fear. The EMF meters in their hands spiked violently, the readings off the charts. The spirit box began to crackle with distorted voices, speaking in a guttural language neither man could understand. The words were filled with malice and pain, as if the souls of the damned were trying to communicate through the static. Suddenly, the furnace roared to life, spewing flames and ash into the room. From within the fire, a figure began to emerge, its shape twisting and contorting as it clawed its way out of the furnace. The creature was massive, its skin charred and blackened, with glowing red eyes that burned with a malevolent intelligence. Its claws were like steel talons, and its mouth was filled with rows of razor-sharp teeth. "It's the devil," Davis whispered, his voice trembling with terror. Carter aimed his weapon at the creature, but before he could pull the trigger, the demon lunged at them with inhuman speed. Davis screamed as the beast's claws raked across his chest, tearing through flesh and bone with ease. Blood splattered across the room, and Davis fell to the ground, his body convulsing in agony. Carter fired his weapon, but the bullets seemed to have no effect on the creature. It advanced on him, its eyes burning with hatred. Desperation clawed at Carter's mind as he realized he was facing an entity far beyond human understanding. He could feel the demon's power pressing down on him, crushing his spirit and driving him to the brink of madness. Just as the demon was about to strike, the room was flooded with light. The remaining members of the team, along with a group of armed soldiers, burst into the chamber, their weapons blazing. The demon recoiled from the light, shrieking in pain, and vanished into the shadows. "Move, move!" shouted one of the soldiers as they grabbed Carter and dragged him out of the furnace room. The team made a hasty retreat, but the damage was already done. Davis was dead, and the demon was still out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for its next victim. As they escaped the mill, Carter knew that this was far from over. The darkness that had taken root in Steel Valley was spreading, and they were all just pawns in a much larger, more terrifying game. The night in Steel Valley was suffocating. The air hung thick, heavy with a silence that pulsed with an unnatural energy. The team had dwindled to just 3 now: Agent Reed, Sarah, and the rookie Lucas. The rest were either dead or missing, swallowed by the shadows that seemed to move with malicious intent. "Are you sure this is where we need to be?" Lucas's voice trembled as they approached an old, abandoned steel mill. The structure loomed before them, its skeletal remains bathed in the dim light of their flashlights. Rusted metal groaned as the wind howled through its empty halls, a mournful cry that echoed the despair of the souls that once labored there. Reed nodded, his face drawn with exhaustion and fear. "This is where the signal was last detected. Whatever it is, it's here." They entered the mill, their footsteps echoing like gunshots in the cavernous space. The stench of decay and burnt metal filled their nostrils, and the walls seemed to close in around them. The shadows twisted and writhed, as if alive, as if waiting for the right moment to strike. "Stay close," Reed ordered, his voice a harsh whisper. "We don't know what we're dealing with." As they ventured deeper into the mill, the temperature plummeted. Their breath misted in the air, and their skin prickled with cold sweat. The darkness was impenetrable, their flashlights barely cutting through it. And then they heard it, a low, guttural growl that reverberated through the walls. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest. What the hell was that? Reed raised his gun, motioning for them to stay quiet. The growl grew louder, closer, until it was right on top of them. The ground shook, and the walls seemed to pulse with an unholy life. Suddenly, something massive slammed into Reed, sending him flying across the room. He hit the wall with a sickening crack and crumpled to the ground, his flashlight skittering across the floor. Sarah screamed, firing her gun into the darkness as Lucas frantically tried to pull Reed to his feet. The shadows erupted with movement, and a creature emerged, an abomination of twisted flesh and metal, its eyes glowing with a malevolent light. It was like nothing they had ever seen before, a nightmare given form. It roared, the sound deafening, and charged at them with terrifying speed. Sarah fired again and again, but the bullets seemed to have no effect. The creature grabbed Lucas, its claws sinking into his flesh. He screamed as it lifted him into the air, and with a sickening crunch, it tore him apart, spraying blood and viscera across the room. Reed, barely conscious, watched in horror as the creature turned its attention to Sarah. She tried to run, but it was on her in an instant. It grabbed her by the throat, lifting her off the ground as she struggled, her feet kicking wildly. Her screams echoed through the mill as the creature's grip tightened, and then there was silence. Reed, his vision fading, could do nothing as the creature turned toward him. He could see its eyes now, burning with a hellish fire. The last thing he heard before darkness claimed him was the sound of its claws scraping across the floor as it approached. Reed awoke to searing pain. His vision was blurred, and the world around him swam in a haze of blood and darkness. The creature loomed over him, its form a grotesque amalgamation of flesh and metal, the embodiment of Steel Valley's forgotten horrors. Its breath was hot against his face, reeking of sulfur and decay. He tried to move, but his body refused to obey. Every nerve screamed in agony. The creature's eyes, glowing with an otherworldly fire, bored into his soul, stripping away his defenses, exposing his deepest fears. Reed could feel his sanity slipping away, piece by piece. A voice, deep and guttural, echoed through his mind. It was the creature, but it spoke without words, its thoughts pouring into his head like molten lead. You cannot fight me. You are nothing but a speck of dust in the vastness of eternity. Your flesh is weak. Your mind is fragile. You will break. Reed's vision swam, and he saw flashes of the others. Sarah's lifeless body lying in a pool of blood, Lucas torn apart, his remains scattered like confetti. The images burned into his brain, each one more horrifying than the last. The weight of his failure crushed him. He had led them here, and now they were all dead because of him. But then, deep within the recesses of his mind, a spark ignited, a tiny ember of defiance. He would not die like this, cowering in fear. If he was going to die, he would die fighting. With a guttural scream, Reed summoned the last of his strength. He reached for the knife strapped to his ankle, his fingers closing around the hilt. The creature sensed his intent and snarled, its claws tightening around his throat, but Reed was beyond pain now. He plunged the knife into the creature's side, driving it in with all his remaining strength. The creature howled, a sound that shook the very foundations of the mill. It recoiled, its grip loosening just enough for Reed to twist the knife deeper. Black ichor poured from the wound, hissing as it hit the ground. But the creature was not so easily defeated. It lashed out, its claws raking across Reed's chest, tearing through flesh and bone. Reed screamed, but he did not relent. With a final desperate push, he drove the knife upward, piercing the creature's heart, if it had one. The creature froze, its eyes wide with shock. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. Then, with a deafening roar, it exploded into a cloud of ash and shadow, dissipating into the air like a bad dream. Reed collapsed to the ground, blood pouring from his wounds, his vision fading. As he lay there on the brink of death, he heard a sound, a voice soft and distant calling his name. It was Sarah, but she was dead, wasn't she? He tried to focus, but the darkness was closing in, pulling him down into its cold embrace. It's over, he thought as he let go, surrendering to the void. It's finally over. But as the darkness claimed him, The last thing he saw was a figure standing over him, a figure with glowing eyes watching, waiting. The nightmare was far from over. Steel Valley had claimed him, just as it had claimed so many before. And in the end, there would be no escape from the devil that dwelled within.